Please subscribe and share for more story. They placed Margaret Holloway at table 22, hidden behind a towering wall of orchids and greenery so thick it blocked half the ballroom. It was the kind of placement meant to erase someone politely. Margaret noticed immediately and smiled. At 66, she had learned that underestimation was a gift. The groom, Reid, clearly believed he was marrying into a soft, uncomplicated family. He had no idea he was stepping into a fortress. 3 days from now, he would knock on Margaret's door with a folder of documents meant to scare and confuse her. Instead, it would amuse her for weeks. Lucas didn't know that the quiet widow with sensible shoes had spent the last 3 years preparing for men exactly like him. As music drifted through the grand hall, Margaret folded her hands calmly in her lap. Let them hide her. Let them think she was small. The most dangerous people were never seated at the center of the room. The morning had begun with optimism. Margaret stood in front of her bedroom mirror, evaluating her reflection with strategic care. She chose a soft slate blue dress, simple, conservative, harmless, and paired it with a single strand of old pearls that belonged to her mother. Her hair had been neatly set at a modest salon in downtown Providence. Nothing extravagant. Nothing that hinted at power. When she arrived at the venue, her daughter Elena barely glanced at her. "You look fine, Mom," Elena said distractedly, her phone pressed to her ear. "Fine is a blessing," Margaret replied pleasantly. Elena rushed off, consumed by floral disasters and seating chart panic. Margaret watched her go, heart warm and heavy at once. Elena looked radiant, wrapped in family lace that had survived wars, recessions, and secrets. Margaret hoped, truly hoped, that the man Elena was marrying deserved her. But hope, Margaret knew, was not evidence. As guests arrived, the hierarchy became painfully obvious. Lucas's parents swept in like royalty. His mother, Vanessa Reid, wore diamonds that caught the light aggressively, announcing her importance before she spoke. She moved through the room with calculated charm, greeting influential guests while never quite seeing Margaret at all. "Excuse me," Margaret said gently to a passing usher, holding up her place card. "I believe there's been a mistake." The young man glanced, flushed. "No mistake, ma'am. Table 22. Just behind the decorative installation." Decorative installation. How kind. Margaret found her seat behind a jungle of white orchids and hydrangeas. From there, she could see the celebration only through a large gilded mirror across the room. She watched strangers toast, laugh, and admire the spectacle, while she remained carefully out of sight. It was familiar territory, and it suited her perfectly. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Margaret allowed herself that honesty. Elena walked down the aisle glowing, her smile wide with hope. Lucas looked polished and confident in his tailored suit. Applause filled the hall. But during cocktail hour, Margaret noticed something else, something more interesting. Lucas had different smiles. A warm, dazzling one for wealthy guests. A polite, measured one for useful connections. And no smile at all for anyone who had nothing to offer. "Mrs. Holloway," a voice said smoothly. Margaret turned to find Lucas standing beside her, flashing his brightest grin. "Isn't this incredible?" he said, gesturing broadly. "You must be so proud." "Oh, overwhelmed," Margaret replied sweetly. "Though I will say, the view from here is enlightening." He laughed lightly, missing or ignoring the edge. "We should spend time together soon," he continued. "Really talk about family." "How refreshing," Margaret said. "Most people do that before marriage." His smile twitched. "Just for a moment. Dinner?" Lucas suggested quickly. "Just us. I have ideas about collaboration." "Collaboration," Margaret repeated. "How exciting." Thursday was agreed upon. A private restaurant. A quiet table. As Lucas moved away, Margaret caught her reflection in the mirror again, a gray-haired woman alone behind flowers, looking harmless and forgotten. Exactly the image she had cultivated since her husband died. Exactly the image men like Lucas trusted. The newlywed glow lasted 48 hours. Then Elena began calling daily. "He's so responsible, Mom," she gushed. Always talking about planning ahead. Planning is important, Margaret said gently. You sound strange. Just tired, sweetheart. But Margaret wasn't tired. She was alert. The word planning lingered like smoke. Thursday was coming. And so was the performance. Thursday evening arrived with the emotional weight of an audit. Margaret dressed carefully, choosing a plain black dress that suggested dignity, without wealth. Around her wrist, she wore her late husband's old watch, cracked glass, stopped hands, perfectly convincing. The restaurant Lucas selected was discreet and intimidating, the kind of place where the staff judged silently. Lucas was already seated when she arrived, confident and composed. "Margaret," he said warmly, standing. "You look wonderful." "How kind," she replied, taking her seat. "This place feels selective." They ordered wine. Lucas chose an expensive bottle, without asking. Margaret noticed everything. As he swirled his glass, he smiled like a man who believed the outcome was guaranteed. "So," he began casually, "how are you managing on your own these days?" "Very well," Margaret said. "I've had years of practice being underestimated." He laughed, missing the warning entirely. "But surely it's overwhelming sometimes," Lucas continued. "A big house. Decisions. Finances." Margaret tilted her head. "Arthur always said solitude sharpened the mind." Lucas nodded, pretending admiration. "Still, people can take advantage of kindness." "People like who?" she asked softly. He leaned forward. "Contractors. Advisors. Even relatives." "How thoughtful of you," Margaret said. "I've spoken to a lawyer," Lucas added smoothly. "Someone who specializes in elder protection." Elder. The word landed with intention. He slid a folder across the table. "Just safeguards. Power of attorney. Medical decisions. Financial oversight." Margaret opened it slowly. "Total control, disguised as care." "This is thorough," she said. "Clara thinks it's brilliant," Lucas replied quickly. Margaret smiled. "Of course she does." "You don't feel pressured, do you?" Lucas asked, watching her closely. "Pressure," she echoed. "At my age, dear, pressure is optional." He laughed again, tension slipping through his cracks. "These things work best when handled quickly," he said. "Questions arise otherwise." "Questions about what?" "Capacity," he said gently. Margaret closed the folder. "I'll review this with my attorney." His smile faltered. "Your attorney?" "Yes," she said pleasantly. "I like explanations in simple language." "I really think we should finalize tonight," Lucas said, voice tightening. "And I really think rush decisions are dangerous," Margaret replied. Silence stretched. He recalibrated. "Of course," he said finally. "Take your time." But his eyes said he was done pretending. Monday morning, Lucas called. "I hope you've thought about it," he said. "I've thought about little else," Margaret replied. "Wonderful. Perhaps I could come by your home. Privacy helps." "How considerate," she said. "Wednesday evening?" On Wednesday, Margaret prepared like a general. Neutral clothing, bare jewelry, calm expression. Lucas arrived with a briefcase and confidence. He spread documents across her coffee table like ownership. "I've brought examples," he began. "Before that," Margaret said calmly, "tell me about your background." He hesitated. "Investment consulting." "For whom?" "Independently." "How long have you targeted widows?" The room went still. "I think there's a misunderstanding," Lucas said carefully. "I don't," Margaret replied. "I understand predators perfectly." His composure cracked. "You're accusing me of fraud." "I'm observing a pattern," she said. "What pattern?" "Urgency. Isolation. Control." She leaned forward. "And the mistake you made." "What mistake?" "Assuming I was helpless." His phone buzzed. He ignored it. "I've recorded this conversation," Margaret continued calmly. "So has my investigator. And my lawyer is preparing charges." Color drained from his face. "You can't prove." "I can prove debts," she said. "Gambling losses. Other victims." His hands trembled. "You need to leave," Margaret said softly. As he gathered his papers, she smiled. The harmless widow had finished pretending. The next morning, Margaret stood at the top of the basement stairs holding a small brass key she had never used before. The house was silent, thick with memory. The scent of her late husband Henry still lingered faintly in the air. Clean soap and old books. Behind a concealed concrete panel, she found the safe he had installed decades earlier. Inside were neatly organized documents, bank statements, investment records, and at the bottom, a handwritten letter. "My dearest Margaret," it began. "If you are reading this, someone has tried to steal from you." Her hands shook as she read. Henry had left $40 million in protected assets, hidden deliberately. He had lived modestly, so she could live safely. Margaret sat down hard in his old chair, stunned. Everything made sense now. The caution, the secrecy, the patience. He had been preparing her for this moment long before she realized it. At the end of the letter was a business card. Rachel Monroe, attorney. Margaret called immediately. "I believe my husband arranged for you to help me," she said. "I've been waiting," Rachel replied calmly. Rachel was younger than Margaret expected, sharp-eyed and precise. She laid out the truth without drama. The money was held in an irrevocable trust. Margaret controlled it fully, but no one else ever could. "Even if you sign Lucas's papers," Rachel said, "he'd get nothing." Margaret exhaled, relief washing through her. "And now?" Margaret asked. "Now," Rachel said, smiling slightly, "we make sure he never tries this again." That evening, Elena called, her voice anxious. "Lucas is upset. He won't say why." "We had a conversation," Margaret replied. "He was trying to help you." "Sweetheart," Margaret said gently, "there are things you don't know yet." Silence stretched. "Tomorrow," Margaret continued, "I'll show you everything." Elena whispered, "Okay." Margaret hung up and looked around her living room. The quiet no longer felt lonely. It felt powerful. Rachel called an hour later. "I've spoken with a federal prosecutor," she said. "Elder fraud. They're interested." Margaret smiled. "Good," she said. "Let's set the trap." The plan was simple. Margaret would call Lucas and agree to sign. Everything would be recorded. On Sunday, Elena came over, her face pale with worry. "He keeps asking about Dad's finances," she admitted. "Because he's desperate," Margaret said gently. "Desperate enough to steal?" Elena nodded slowly. "Show me," she said. Monday morning, Margaret made the call. "You were right," she told Lucas. "I need protection." Relief flooded his voice. "We'll do this today," he said. 3 o'clock, Margaret replied. "At my house." She hung up and exhaled. The game was almost over. Lucas arrived at exactly 3, briefcase in hand, notary beside him. Cameras were hidden. "I'm proud of you," he said smoothly. "I trust you," Margaret replied softly. As she signed, she paused. "There might be more money," she said casually. His eyes lit up. "How much?" She smiled. "That's where it gets interesting." The door opened. "Lucas Reid, you're under arrest." Chaos followed. Handcuffs clicked. Margaret watched calmly. Justice, she thought, was patient. He news broke that evening. Elena arrived an hour later, her eyes red and confused. Margaret sat her down at the kitchen table and pressed play. Lucas's voice filled the room, confident, greedy, careless. He explained his plan in his own words, never realizing he was documenting his downfall. Elena covered her mouth as the truth unfolded. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I know," Margaret said gently. The next morning, Elena filed for divorce. Lucas's bail was set at $500,000, money he didn't have. Federal investigators widened the case, uncovering connections across multiple states. By September, the trial began. The recordings were undeniable. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty on all counts. Margaret didn't smile. Justice wasn't something to celebrate loudly. It was something to build carefully. At sentencing, the judge's voice was sharp with contempt. "You exploited trust and family," he said. 18 years. Lucas never looked at Margaret. Later, She and Rachel returned to the same restaurant where it had all begun. "You're a legend," Rachel said, raising her glass. Margaret shook her head. "I was just prepared." "What's next?" Margaret thought of the other victims, the ones without hidden safes or lawyers. "We make sure this never happens again," she said. Within months, Lucas's associates came knocking, hoping to bargain. Margaret sent them straight to federal agents. One by one, the network collapsed. The investigation uncovered millions stolen from dozens of victims. Margaret directed her recovered share back to them. Then she founded a national program using the trust's funding, legal support, investigators, education. They called it the Holloway Guard. Arrests increased. Fraud reports dropped. Criminal forums whispered warnings. "Don't touch widows," they said. "Not anymore." 2 years later, Margaret stood at a podium, calm and unshaken. "To those who prey on the elderly," she said, "we are watching." The applause was thunderous. Power, she realized, wasn't loud. It was organized. 5 years into a sentence, Lucas applied for parole. Margaret appeared before the board, not as a victim, but as evidence. "He isn't remorseful," she said evenly. "Only angry he failed." Parole was denied. The war was over. The program became permanent, funded by seized criminal assets. Henry's legacy had become a shield for thousands. Margaret returned home that evening, sat in her favorite chair, and smiled softly. Some lessons cost millions. Some legacies saved lives. Margaret no longer sat behind flowers. She chose visibility now on her own terms. When asked how she did it, she always answered the same way. "I paid attention," she said. The world had learned something important. Never underestimate a widow. Some stories don't end quietly. They change the rules. In the months that followed, Margaret's life settled into a new rhythm. Interviews came and went, though she accepted only a few. She preferred quiet work to loud praise. Each morning, she reviewed reports from the Holloway Guard, reading case summaries and outcomes. "They caught another one," Rachel told her one afternoon. "Good," Margaret replied. "That means someone slept peacefully tonight." She learned that justice, when done properly, was rarely dramatic. It was paperwork, patience, and persistence. And she was very good at all three. Elena visited often. Their conversations were gentler now, slower. "I should have seen it," Elena said once. "You saw what you were meant to see at the time," Margaret replied. They rebuilt trust carefully, brick by brick. Elena began volunteering with the program, helping other families recognize warning signs before it was too late. "I want to protect people," she said quietly. Margaret smiled. "That's how it starts." Letters arrived daily from victims, from families, from strangers. Some thanked her. Others asked for help. Margaret read every one. "Why do you do this?" a reporter once asked. "Because silence protects the wrong people," Margaret answered. She had learned that lesson late in life, but she intended to use what time remained wisely. Years passed. The Holloway Guard expanded nationwide. Training programs were introduced. Hotlines stayed busy. Predators adapted, but so did the defenders. Margaret aged quietly, gracefully. She walked slower. She listened more. But her mind remained sharp. Power didn't fade, she realized. It simply changed shape. One evening, Margaret returned to the basement. She stood before the empty safe and placed Henry's letter back inside. "You did good," she whispered. She closed the panel gently. Some marriages ended in grief. Others continued as purpose. At 80, Margaret declined a final award. "I've already been honored," she said, "by outcomes." She spent her days gardening, reading, and answering emails from young lawyers who wanted to learn. "Be patient," she always told them, "and never confuse kindness with weakness." Margaret Holloway was once hidden behind flowers, mistaken for something small. She became something permanent, a warning, a shield, a legacy. And somewhere, in prison libraries and whispered conversations, one truth endured. The most dangerous mistake a predator can make is assuming survival looks fragile.